It was the spring of 2016 when I first decided to take Emily camping with me on the tiny, isolated island near the Louisiana coast where my family owned a small plot of land. The plot wasn't much, barely more than a patch of sand and brush, but it was far enough from civilization to feel like an adventure. I'd scouted it several times over the years, so I knew the area well, though it was always a challenge getting there. The island bordered the main ship channel, just a few miles from the Gulf of Mexico, and it wasn't exactly a place you could reach with ease. Emily and I had been friends for a few years by then, and I figured this would be a fun trip. She had never been camping in such an isolated spot, but I promised her it'd be a memorable experience. My plan was to take the small boat I'd bought last year, cross the channel, and hike up the thicket to set up camp on the hilltop. I had everything packed: gear, food, and a rifle for some hunting. But of course, nothing ever goes as planned. The weather had been perfect that day. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the humidity hadn't hit yet. I backed the truck down to the boat launch at the edge of the marshland, where the bayou met the channel. The boat was a small, beat-up craft with a shallow draft, perfect for these types of waters. We loaded it up with gear, and I backed it into the water. I knew the routine by now: push the boat through the low, muddy water for about 60 yards before we hit the deeper channels. But on this particular trip, the water was even lower than usual. "Ready for this?" I asked Emily as I glanced over at her. She was excited, but there was a nervousness in her eyes. "I think so," she said, though her hands were gripping the sides of the boat a little too tightly. I started the engine, and we slowly made our way toward the island. The boat bucked a little against the gentle current, but it wasn't anything we couldn't handle. It took a little longer than usual to get to the spot I wanted, but we finally reached the shallow sandy bottom where I'd tie off the boat. The shoreline was only a few feet away, but with the water so low, it was a struggle to drag the boat closer. We had to get out and wade through the muck to pull it the last stretch. Once the boat was secured to the shore, I jammed a large aluminum rod deep into the sand, tethering it to a long rope. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep the boat from drifting off if the wind picked up. Emily grabbed the rest of the gear and we hiked inland. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the island. We reached the clearing on the hill, a small rise overlooking the sand where the boat was tied up below. Everything seemed peaceful, almost idyllic, but then I noticed the first problem. The mosquitoes. They were everywhere. The air was thick with them. I looked over at Emily, who was already swatting at her neck. "I thought you had the repellent?" she asked, voice tinged with frustration. I froze for a moment, realizing I had forgotten the most important item. I cursed under my breath, knowing we were in for a miserable night. The island was full of them, and without any repellent, we were in for a hell of a time. But we carried on, setting up camp in the thickets near the bluff, trying to ignore the incessant buzzing around our heads. We figured we could hunt for some food later after setting up. The sun set quickly, casting the sky into shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, almost surreal, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Then came the sounds of the island, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and oddly, a faint snuffling noise in the brush. I didn't think much of it at first. We had seen tracks, though, huge hog tracks, and the last thing I wanted was to get too close to a wild boar, especially at dusk. I checked the rifle. It was loaded, but there wasn't much we could do if a hog charged. We figured we'd stay close to camp, but Emily insisted we do some hunting, even if just for a while. We made our way deeper into the thickets, careful of the dry leaves underfoot and the occasional branch snapping. Every now and then, we'd hear something moving off in the distance. A pig, probably. But we didn't get any good shots. The air was thick with the scent of the swamp, and the mosquitoes were relentless. We found a small patch of grass and decided to sit for a bit, waiting for any movement. The hours passed, and nothing really happened. No wild boar, no rabbits. Just a beautiful sunset. We ate a quick snack and prepared to head back to camp. That's when everything went sideways. The night had fallen quickly, and I realized just how unprepared we were. No flashlight, no way to navigate the thick brush. I checked my rifle, and the only light I had was the laser on the scope. Useless. Emily was already on edge, and we were walking carefully back, not sure where we were going. Then we heard it. The pigs. We couldn't see them, but we could hear them moving in the brush, snuffling, crashing through the undergrowth. They were close, too close for comfort. Emily's panic was palpable as we hurried to make our way out of the thicket. "Just keep moving," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if it helped. The sound of the pigs darting between trees was deafening. I had no choice but to push forward slowly, trying to keep us on course, even as the pigs kept circling us. I could feel my heart racing as we finally stumbled out of the thick undergrowth, emerging onto a narrow path. My relief was short-lived, though, as we had to deal with a new problem: wild cattle. We made it back to camp, only to find a herd of cows had wandered in. One of them bumped into my tent, breaking one of the poles. Great. Now we had pigs, cows, and mosquitoes to deal with. But we started a fire and ate, trying to salvage what we could from the mess. When we crawled into the tent that night, things only got worse. The humidity was so thick it felt like we were sleeping inside a sauna. Sweat soaked through my clothes, and I could hear the droplets of moisture hitting the sides of the tent. It was around 2 a.m. when the fog rolled in. Everything outside became muffled, the world wrapped in a suffocating blanket of mist. I tossed and turned, trying to sleep, but it felt like I was drowning in the thick air. Emily's uneasy breathing filled the tent as she lay beside me. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the waves crashing against the shore. But no, this sound was different. It was louder, more intense. The sound of waves crashing violently against something. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was that? I looked at Emily, who had also woken up, her face pale with fear. I grabbed my rifle, but I wasn't sure what I was expecting. The sound continued, and it dawned on me. The ship channel was near, and then it hit me. The boat! The fog was so thick, I couldn't see anything, and the sound of the waves was only growing louder. I scrambled out of the tent, my heart pounding in my ears, and ran down to the shore. The laser on my AR illuminated nothing but dense fog and the murky water. The only light was the dim, sickly glow of the moon. I scanned the shoreline, hoping for a glimpse of the boat, but it wasn't there. I froze in panic. My boat, my only way off the island, was gone. Gone. My stomach turned, and a cold sweat broke out over me. I started shining the laser in all directions, hoping for some reflection. It took about a minute, but I saw something. A glint, a shiny piece of metal reflecting back at me. The registration tag. It was floating out in the channel, way too far from the shore. Panic set in. Without thinking, I ditched my gun, stripped off my pants, and plunged into the water. The ship channel was no joke. It was wide, deep, and the current was strong. But I couldn't stop. I had to get to that boat. I swam, my heart racing, feeling the cold water pulling at me, the fog swallowing everything around me. The sound of waves crashing became deafening as I pushed harder, my muscles burning. The boat was tangled in the trees, the rope wrapped around the bow, half submerged. It was taking on water fast. By some miracle, I managed to untangle the rope and drag the boat back toward the shore. It was barely afloat, but I got it back. By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted. My body ached from the cold water and the swim, and my mind was barely functioning. I woke up that morning, determined to make the most of our camping trip. It had been a long time since I had taken my kids out, and I had been looking forward to getting away from the usual grind. My husband, Jack, wasn't going to be able to join us until later. He was going to work his shift and drive out after, which meant I would be doing all the setup alone. The kids, Ella and Ben, were excited, full of energy, and eager for our little adventure. They were 4 and 6, old enough to enjoy the experience, but young enough to need constant attention. We had decided to go to a remote site about an hour away from home. It was tucked in the edge of the woods, next to a small, quiet lake. I'd been there a couple of times before with Jack, and I thought it would be perfect for a family trip. I had everything packed the night before: sleeping bags, camping stove, food, and the big old tent. It was one of those giant tents, the kind that you can stand up in, with separate rooms and multiple zippers that always seem to get stuck. The tent was at least 15 years old, maybe more, and it wasn't the easiest thing to set up. But I thought I could manage as long as I had a little help. That help wasn't going to show up until late, so it was up to me. I loaded up the car with the kids and all the gear, and we made our way out. The drive was peaceful, just the kids and me singing along to songs on the radio. Ella was already asking me about the lake, her little hands pressed to the window as she peered out. Ben, on the other hand, was in a constant state of motion, fidgeting and bouncing in the back seat. By the time we got there, I could already feel the weight of the day ahead. I parked the car and unloaded everything. The kids were practically vibrating with excitement. "Can we go to the water?" Ella asked, her eyes wide. I told her we'd get to that after the tent was set up. She and Ben ran off to play in the dirt while I struggled with the tent. The first challenge was finding a good spot. The ground was uneven in places, and I had to clear rocks and sticks to make a flat area. By the time I had that figured out, the kids were already off exploring, and I had to keep an eye on them while trying to lay out the tarp and unfold the tent. The process took longer than I expected, an hour instead of 10 minutes, and it was exhausting. I was sweating, covered in dirt, and trying to keep the kids from wandering too far. Ben had already found a stick and was pretending to sword fight with it, while Ella had discovered a patch of wildflowers and was inspecting them intently. It felt like it was all happening in fast forward. When I finally got the tent up, I quickly moved the gear inside. I had to set up the sleeping bags, arrange everything neatly, and make sure the kids had everything they needed. By the time I got them inside the tent, it was already getting late. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and the air had that crisp evening feel to it. The kids were tired but not ready to sleep, so I gave them some snacks to settle them down. We spent some time in the tent, talking about our plans for the next day, before I finally managed to get them to lie down. It wasn't long before Jack showed up. He'd had a long day at work, but he looked relieved to finally be there. We got the fire going, and for a little while, everything felt normal. The kids were laughing, roasting marshmallows, and the night felt peaceful. There was something comforting about the flickering light of the fire in the middle of the dark woods. Jack and I talked for a while as the kids drifted off to sleep, finally giving in to exhaustion. We crawled into the tent later that night. The wind rustled the trees outside, and I could hear the occasional splash from the lake. I felt the weight of the day hit me then. Setting up camp, keeping the kids entertained, and dealing with all the small details. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, and within minutes, I was asleep. But then, hours later, something woke me up. I didn't know what time it was, but it felt like the middle of the night. The air was heavy, thick with humidity. My mind was foggy, and I struggled to focus. And then I heard it. A loud, wet, gagging noise came from Ben. My eyes snapped open just in time to see him coughing and retching in the darkness. It took me a moment to realize what was happening. He was vomiting. The smell hit me almost immediately, sharp and sour. Before I could react, Ella started coughing too. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag fumbling in the dark to get to them. But it was too late. Both of them were vomiting everywhere, splashing their bodies and the sleeping bags. I could hear them gagging, the noise chilling me to the bone. I grabbed them, holding them as best as I could while trying to keep the mess from getting worse. My heart was racing, and I couldn't think clearly. The smell was overpowering, and the whole tent felt suffocating. The mess kept coming, more than I could ever have imagined from their little bodies. Jack woke up in a daze, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no time for explanation. We had to get them out of there. I grabbed the wipes, trying to clean them off as best as I could in the middle of the night, but it was a losing battle. The car was the only place where we could get them cleaned up. I helped Jack pack the kids into the back seat as quickly as I could, ignoring the fact that both of them were covered in vomit. The air was thick with the smell as I rushed to get the car started. Once we were in the car, I didn't care about the mess anymore. I just wanted to get us home, as far away from that campsite as possible. Jack stayed behind to clean up the tent, and we drove off into the night. The kids were both quiet now, exhausted from the ordeal. They occasionally let out little sniffles from the back seat, but for the most part, the car ride was eerily silent. The headlights cut through the darkness, and the road seemed endless. Ben was too young to fully understand what had happened, but Ella kept asking why she felt so sick. I didn't have an answer for her, but I promised myself that I wouldn't let them go through something like that again. It was hours before we made it home, and by then, the smell of vomit had permeated the car entirely. The kids were both passed out, exhausted from the stress of the night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my head. What went wrong? Was it the food? Was it something we didn't account for? All I knew was that I never wanted to experience that again. In the weeks that followed, I washed out the car and scrubbed the tent, but the memory lingered. It wasn't the kids being sick that haunted me. It was the feeling of helplessness. I felt like I couldn't protect them from something so sudden and violent. It was terrifying. I couldn't shake the image of them choking on their own sickness in the darkness of the tent. Jack and I talked about it a few times, but it wasn't something we ever wanted to revisit. We didn't go camping again for years after that. The thought of setting up a tent, the possibility of being stuck in another situation like that, made me sick. We eventually took a few short trips here and there, but camping, the thing we used to love, had lost its appeal. It felt like a reminder of that night, of the terror and the helplessness. In the end, we learned something important, that sometimes the things you think will be the best memories can turn into your worst nightmare. And sometimes it's better to leave certain things in the past. I never thought the wilderness could be so unsettling, but that morning, as the first light of dawn crept across the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, I realized how little control you have when you're deep in the wild. It was early September, a time of year that promised a quiet, peaceful solitude in the backcountry. The days were still warm enough for a comfortable hike, but the nights had a bite to them. My wife, Ellie, and our close friend, Mike, and I had been backpacking for 4 days, enjoying the rugged beauty of Wyoming's Bighorns. We had hiked some of the more popular routes earlier, but now we were heading into more remote areas, far off any marked trails. We had reached a little alpine lake, about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead. The landscape here was raw, untouched. Huge granite boulders dotted the landscape, and the trees were thick with pines, their tall, dark trunks standing like sentinels. There was a sense of timelessness here, the kind of place where nature felt as old as the earth itself. The lake was small, barely a mile across, and so clear that you could see the stones at the bottom. It was the kind of spot you dream of finding when you think about getting away from everything. After setting up camp, we spent the afternoon relaxing by the lake, enjoying the view, and cooking our freeze-dried meals. The sun had dipped below the peaks by the time we crawled into our tents. Mike, always a heavy sleeper, was snoring within minutes. Ellie and I lay awake for a while, listening to the soft, whispering breeze through the trees and watching the stars. It was one of those nights where everything felt perfectly still, like the world was holding its breath. I woke up just before dawn. The sky was still dark, the kind of inky black that only a remote place like this could provide. The air was cold, biting, and the stillness felt absolute. Then suddenly there was this sound. At first it was faint, distant, and strange. I couldn't make it out, so I lay there for a moment, my heart starting to race, trying to make sense of it. And then it hit me full force. It sounded like a truck. Not a car, but a full-size truck. One of those old diesel models with a loud engine, roaring through the forest at 40 miles per hour. The kind of noise you never expect to hear in the middle of nowhere. My first thought was that somehow, someone had driven all the way up here, which was impossible. There weren't any roads this far into the backcountry, let alone a truck that could have reached us. My heart pounded in my chest. The sound echoed, rolling across the valley and between the trees, so loud it made the hairs on my neck stand up. I froze, not knowing what to do. It wasn't the sound of an animal, at least not anything I'd ever heard before. It was mechanical, like the noise of gears grinding against each other. The truck-like sound went on for a few moments, and then it suddenly stopped, as if someone had turned off the engine. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, trying to listen for anything else. The silence that followed was deafening. It felt too quiet, unnaturally so, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. I glanced over at Ellie, still fast asleep, oblivious to the noise. Mike was snoring gently in his tent, his body rising and falling with each breath. I didn't dare leave the safety of the tent to investigate. If there was something out there, I didn't want to know. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the kind that grips you when you know something isn't right but you can't figure out exactly what it is. After what felt like an eternity, the noise never came back. The world outside was still and silent. I sat there in the dark, barely able to move, my mind racing through all the possibilities. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? A person somehow lost or stranded? I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my thoughts kept circling back to the sound. I finally gave up trying to sleep, and as the first light of day began to creep into the sky, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap in the face. I took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling my lungs, and started scanning the lake and the surrounding trees. Everything was still. The lake shimmered faintly in the morning light, its surface untouched by any disturbance. I walked toward the edge of the lake, hoping to get a better view of whatever it was that had made that noise. As I stepped closer, I froze. There, just at the edge of the water, I saw them. Two moose, a cow and her calf, both standing knee-deep in the lake, calmly drinking from the crystal-clear water. The realization hit me like a wave. It had been the sound of their massive bodies moving through the dense forest. They must have been coming down to the lake for their morning drink, their heavy hooves pushing through the underbrush, snapping branches along the way. The combination of the quiet morning and the sheer size of these animals had made the noise sound so much louder than it really was. I let out a long breath, a mix of relief and embarrassment flooding over me. That's all it was, a couple of moose. There was nothing out there but the normal, natural rhythms of the wilderness. But for a few minutes, I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, caught between the real world and something I couldn't explain. I stood there for a long while just watching them. The cow and her calf moved with a kind of quiet grace, their large, dark eyes flicking toward me for just a moment before they went back to their drinking. It was one of those rare moments in life when you feel like you're seeing something truly wild, something untamed and beautiful, untouched by human hands. The lake stretched out before them, a mirror to the mountain peaks that loomed above us. The sun had started to rise higher now, casting a soft golden light across the landscape. I turned back to camp, shaking my head at myself. I had let my imagination run wild, my mind filling in the gaps with all the worst possibilities. But there was nothing to fear here, no ghosts or monsters, just the sound of nature, amplified by the quiet of the mountains. When I got back to camp, Mike was already awake, stretching out his stiff limbs, while Ellie was slowly stirring in her sleeping bag. I started packing up our gear, my hands moving almost mechanically. The mood had shifted. Gone was the tension from the night before. The whole camp felt warmer, more alive, now that the sun was higher in the sky. As I made our breakfast, a simple mix of oatmeal and coffee, I glanced back at the lake. The moose were still there, grazing quietly at the edge. I couldn't help but smile. It was a peaceful, almost idyllic sight. As we sat down to eat, I could feel the unease from earlier slipping away. The mountains, the trees, the lake. They all felt more familiar now, less foreign, less frightening. The world had a way of making you feel small and insignificant, but it also had a way of putting things back into perspective. By the time we finished our meal, the moose had moved off into the trees, disappearing into the dense underbrush. The forest around us was still, but now it felt comforting, like a friend that had been there all along. The strange noise from earlier, the tension, all seemed like a distant memory. I took a deep breath, the scent of pine and fresh earth filling my lungs, and for the first time that morning, I felt truly at peace. It wasn't the wilderness that was unsettling. It was my own mind, running wild in the quiet. I learned that morning that in a place like this, where silence is so complete, the smallest things could seem terrifying. But when you take a moment to really look, to really listen, everything falls back into place. We packed up our camp and started our hike back out, the bighorns fading into the distance behind us. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, at the lake, at the forest, at the peaks. There was something about the place that stuck with you, something deeper than just the beauty of it all. I knew I'd be back someday, but for now, the only thing left to fear was the long hike ahead. I had been thinking about this camping trip for weeks. A weekend in a small village, deep in the woods, sounded like the perfect way to escape the noise and stress of the city. It was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, just what I needed to get away from everything. I arrived on Friday evening, just as the sun was going down. The village was small, barely a handful of houses scattered around. The people didn't even look up as I drove past. I found a spot to camp on the edge of the forest, right next to a little creek that moved slowly through the trees. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and just sat there for a while, enjoying the calm. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the distant birds and the leaves rustling in the trees. As the night came on, the temperature dropped. I started a fire, cooked myself a quick meal, and leaned back, taking in the stillness around me. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, and it made the night feel peaceful. But then something caught my eye. There was movement in the trees, just outside the light from the fire. I squinted, trying to see, but couldn't make it out. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But something didn't feel right. It didn't move like an animal should. I tried to push the thought out of my head, telling myself I was just imagining things. But as the night went on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was like the air itself was heavier, and the quiet around me started to feel wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just waiting, hidden in the shadows. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. The fire flickered, casting long, twisting shadows around my camp. I kept my eyes on those shadows, waiting for them to show me what was hiding out there. And then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and steady, crunching the dry leaves and twigs on the forest floor, just a little way from my tent. My heart jumped in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, but there was nothing. The darkness was thick, and I could only see the dark shapes of the trees, their branches moving in the wind. My hands shook, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just some animal passing by. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was out there. I stayed awake, listening to every sound, every rustle in the woods. The footsteps came again, but this time they were closer, almost like whatever it was had been circling around me. It was too quiet, too still. I felt trapped, with nothing but the weak light of the fire and the thin walls of my tent between me and whatever was out there. Every time the wind gusted, the shadows seemed to move, and I felt like I was being surrounded, like something was waiting for the right moment to come closer. The hours dragged on, and I grew more and more anxious, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I was stuck, unable to sleep, listening to the soft footsteps that seemed to never stop. It felt like the night was closing in on me, like I was no longer alone in that quiet, dark forest. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. I packed up my things quickly, not even bothering to eat or drink. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was rolling up my tent, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a set of footprints in the dirt, right around the edge of my campsite. They were too big to be from any animal, and they were way too close to my tent. Whoever or whatever had been out there had been watching me the whole time, staying just out of sight. I didn't stick around. I packed up and left the village as fast as I could, my heart still racing, my mind reeling. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew what I felt, and what I felt was fear. Fear that something had been out there with me, something that hadn't been seen but had definitely been there. Now, whenever I think about that night, the thing that sticks with me isn't just the strange feeling of being watched. It's the footprints, the fresh, clear footprints around my camp. I can still picture them in my mind, the way they were right there, so close, and how no one else could have made them. I don't know what it was or who it was, but I'll never forget it. I never went back to that village, and I never will. I learned something that weekend. Some places are better left untouched, and some things are better left unseen. I'm not sure what was out there in those woods, but I know it wasn't something I wanted to meet again. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Me, my wife, and her sister, Sarah, headed up to the mountains for some camping. We rented a small cabin by a quiet lake, far from the nearest town, the kind of place where your phone barely works, and the only sounds you hear are the wind through the trees and the occasional animal in the distance. We got there late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The cabin was simple but cozy, just enough room for the three of us. After we settled in, we started a fire outside, and Sarah got out some snacks for us to munch on while we relaxed. The air was cool, and everything felt peaceful. Too peaceful, almost. But as the night went on, the calm started to feel more strange than comforting. Every now and then, I'd hear a twig snap in the woods, and it made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. But each time I looked away or turned my back, it felt like someone was watching us. Around midnight, Sarah said she wanted to take a walk down to the lake. My wife didn't really want to, but Sarah insisted. They grabbed their flashlights and headed out, and I stayed behind to keep the fire going. I didn't like the idea of them walking off into the dark, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. Soon after they left, I started feeling really uneasy. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and I kept hearing strange noises from the woods. It wasn't animals. Something about it felt off. A few times, I thought I heard footsteps in the leaves, But when I looked around, there was nothing there. My stomach tightened. After what felt like hours, my wife and Sarah finally came back. They looked pale, like they'd seen a ghost. At first, they didn't say much, but I could see the tension in their faces. I asked what happened, but neither of them would tell me anything. All I could get was that they'd felt like they were being watched. They'd heard footsteps, branches breaking, and even whispers. I tried not to think much of it, just their imagination, right? It was just the woods, after all. We went to bed not long after that, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing things outside, the sound of something moving around, scratching at the door. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too close. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound stopped whenever I tried to look. Whatever it was close, too close. In the morning, I decided to check things out. I went around the cabin, checked the door, the windows, the area outside. Everything seemed fine, but there were strange marks in the dirt around the porch, like something had been walking around the cabin. My mind raced. It didn't make sense. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the day went on, it only got worse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time we went outside, it felt like something was lurking just out of sight. We kept hearing noises from the woods, footsteps, rustling, and sometimes the sounds of twigs snapping under weight. But it wasn't animals. It felt too purposeful, too constant, like something was moving around us, studying us, waiting. By late afternoon, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She wanted to leave, and even my wife was starting to feel the same way. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in the air. It was like the woods were closing in on us. We decided to pack up and go home. I loaded everything into the car, and we started the long drive back. The whole trip was silent. None of us said much. The quiet in the car was deafening. Everyone was lost in their thoughts, and I couldn't help but keep looking at the trees as we drove. As we neared the edge of the woods, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. Something standing just inside the tree line. A figure. It was too far away to see clearly, but I could tell it was tall, thin, and unmoving. It was like it was watching us, waiting for us to leave. I didn't stop the car. Couldn't. I just kept driving, not looking back. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, though. It stuck with us the whole ride, like an icy hand pressing down on our backs. The rest of the trip was quiet, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure. What if we had stayed longer? What if we had gone out into the woods like Sarah had wanted? I kept thinking about the feeling in the air, the way the woods seemed to watch us, the way the noises never stopped. It was like something was waiting, knowing we would leave. I never went back to that cabin. In fact, I don't think I'll ever camp again, not in a place like that. I don't know what it was out there, in those trees, but I know one thing for sure, whatever it wasn't going to let us leave without a reason. And if we had stayed any longer, maybe it would have done something about it. Something worse. I've always loved camping, but things felt different when my cousin, a retired Army officer, decided to join me. He'd been through some tough times, so I figured he'd know how to handle whatever came our way. We chose a spot deep in the woods, far enough from the usual campsites to feel alone, but not so far that it would take forever to get out if we needed to. We set up our tents and got a fire going, the kind that's strong enough to keep the dark away. As the night grew darker, I realized how quiet it was. Too quiet. The usual sounds of crickets or distant animals weren't there. My cousin didn't seem bothered by it, though. He was always alert, scanning the trees and sometimes looking up at the sky. I thought maybe it was just his old habits kicking in, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. Later that night, after the fire had burned down to just glowing embers, I went to gather more wood. That's when I heard it. A crunching sound from the forest, like someone was walking slowly, on purpose. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. The sound stopped, then started again, much closer this time. I walked back to the camp, trying to keep my calm, but my heart was racing. My cousin was already packing his gear, moving quietly but quickly. He didn't say anything, but his face told me he knew something wasn't right. We both knew that if it was a bear or some wild animal, it wouldn't be creeping around like that. Then we both heard it, an unmistakable snap of a branch, just a few feet away. That's when it hit me. It wasn't an animal. Someone was out there, watching us. We didn't talk, but I could see in my cousin's eyes that he was calm, too calm. It was the kind of calm that comes from experience. He motioned for me to stay low and slowly started packing the rest of our things. He didn't rush, but he worked fast, setting up a few traps, stuff he learned from his time in the army, to cover our backs if we needed to leave quickly. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every time I looked behind me, I thought I saw something moving in the trees, too fast to be sure, but it was there. My cousin kept his focus, moving quietly and without a sound. We packed up the campsite, making sure everything looked untouched. We didn't use any flashlights, just the dim light from the dying fire. It was dark, but we didn't dare make ourselves visible. When everything was packed, we started moving out, sticking to the shadows, walking fast but careful. I kept expecting to hear something, anything, but it was dead silent. My feet seemed to make more noise than anything else. The feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't until hours later, when we reached the truck and I slammed the door shut, that I felt a slight relief. We didn't see anyone, didn't hear any movement, but the weight of being followed was heavy. It stayed with me the whole way. My cousin didn't say a word as we drove off. There was no need. We both knew we had barely escaped something, or someone, that had been waiting for us. Something that didn't want us there. Even now, when I go camping, I still get that feeling. Like there's someone out there, just beyond the light of the fire, watching. I've learned to never go into the woods without a solid plan. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can still feel those eyes on me. Like whatever was back there, it never really left. It's always out there, waiting just out of sight. And I'm not sure if it's still watching, or if it's just waiting for the right time to show itself. It was supposed to be a calm weekend camping trip. I've been looking forward to it for weeks. The weather was perfect, cool, clear skies, and the kind of night where the stars seemed endless. My dog, Max, was with me and we had everything set up. The tent, a fire pit, and a small stove to cook. Max was running around sniffing everything as usual. I smiled to myself, feeling the peacefulness of the moment. That afternoon, we went for a short hike. It was just me and Max, walking along a quiet trail. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and Max's happy barks whenever he found something interesting. The sun was low, painting the sky in colors of purple and orange. It was getting late, so I decided it was time to head back. By the time we got to the campsite, the fire was crackling, and Max was tired, curling up next to me as I started to cook. The night felt too quiet. Usually, the woods are full of noises. Small animals moving, leaves rustling, the wind shaking the trees. But tonight there was nothing, not a single sound. Max, who usually slept through anything, was wide awake. He was looking around, his body stiff and tense. I thought he was just being his usual anxious self, so I tried to ignore it. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes. It was just at the edge of the campfire's light. My body froze. This wasn't the normal sound of an animal. It was something else. Max's fur stood up, and he slowly got to his feet. His eyes locked on the dark trees beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. We weren't alone. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it towards the noise. The light cut through the dark, but all it revealed were the trees swaying gently. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or some other animal, but the feeling didn't go away. Max was still on edge, pacing and whining softly. Then I heard something else. Footsteps, slow and heavy, crunching the leaves on the ground. My heart started to race. This wasn't an animal. Someone or something was walking toward me. I picked up a thick stick from the ground, my grip tight. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was dead silent again. Max broke the silence with a growl, his voice low and threatening. His growl turned into a loud bark, and he rushed to the edge of the light, stopping right at the border of the fire's glow. I stood up, my hand still holding the stick, trying to see anything in the darkness. There was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the fire crackling. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Two eyes, glowing faintly, just outside the circle of firelight. They were too high up, too wide apart to be any animal I knew. Panic rushed through me. I took a step back, moving towards the tent, never taking my eyes off the dark shape. Max was still barking, more aggressive now. I knew I couldn't turn my back, but all I wanted was to get inside the tent and lock myself in. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to know. The rustling started again, closer now, like whatever was out there was moving toward me. My heart pounded in my chest. I quickly unzipped the tent, ducked inside, and pulled the flap shut behind me. Max barked once more, but the sounds outside stopped. I sat in the dark, clutching the flashlight, holding my breath, hoping whatever it was had gone away. The night was long. I hardly slept, keeping the flashlight on, checking every few minutes to make sure nothing was out there. The air felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. By morning, the woods were still again. Max seemed to relax, but I wasn't sure if it was because he was finally tired or if he felt safe. I didn't feel safe. Not yet. As I packed up to leave, I noticed something odd. There were large footprints around the campsite, not animal tracks. They were too big, too wide. My stomach dropped. I froze, staring at them. They led right up to the edge of the firelight. Whoever or whatever had been there last night had been watching us, and it hadn't gone far. I hurried through the rest of my packing, my hands shaking as I tried to get everything together as quickly as possible. Max didn't seem bothered by the tracks, but I couldn't stop looking at them. When I finally got everything packed into the car, I slammed the door shut and started the engine, not daring to look back at the camp. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me the whole time. The woods had been too quiet, the footsteps too deliberate. And those eyes in the dark, kept flashing through my mind. We weren't alone that night. Whoever or whatever had been out there hadn't gone far. I don't know if it followed me when I left, but I know this for sure. I won't be coming back. Not to that place. Not ever again.